In the early morning on December 7, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base Pearl Harbor. In 2 waves, over 300 Japanese planes, including fighter, torpedo, and dive bomber planes, descended on Pearl Harbor. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 8 U.S. Navy battleships were heavily damaged. 4 battleships were sunk, the most famous being the USS Arizona, whose massive explosion and sinking killed 1,177 officers and crewmen. The attack killed over 2,400 Americans, wounded 1,000 more, and left the nation in a state of shock. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated that December 7, 1941, will forever be a date which will live in infamy. On December 8, 1941, Congress passed a formal declaration of war on Japan, officially entering the United States into World War II. 3 days later, Congress declared war on Germany and Italy. American attitudes changed drastically, and war became a part of American culture, while hysteria spread throughout the country. So what about Japanese Americans? At the time of the attack, 160,000 Japanese Americans lived in Hawaii, another 125,000 on the U.S. mainland. 2/3 were actually born in the United States, or what the Japanese called Nisei. Those born in Japan were referred to as Issei. Japanese American culture valued politeness, harmony, and loyalty. In their communities, the norm was to obey and respect those in authority. Japanese Americans were extremely patriotic, as they knew no other country except the one in which they lived. Unfortunately, prejudice against Japanese Americans already existed before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Many white American workers felt their livelihoods were threatened since immigrants were willing to do the same work for much less. Then there were the more obvious cultural differences, such as appearance, customs, religion, and these were unfamiliar to the rest of the American population, which furthered the diversity and racial tension. Laws were actually passed based on these prejudices, whereby Asian immigrants not born in the U.S. could not become U.S. citizens. There were anti-alien land ownership laws, and in 1924, Congress put a halt to any further Japanese immigration. With war hysteria spreading throughout the U.S., anti-Japanese prejudice erupted into outright hatred. Hall tells us that prejudices are never accurate, and they always distort one's vision in such a way that they always greatly warp our view of others. Nevertheless, the Joint Immigration Committee of California Legislation wrote an anti-Japanese manifesto calling people of Japanese ancestry unassimilable and distributed it to newspapers all over the country. The blatant racial report was backed by the American Legion and the native sons and daughters of the Golden West. Even the military took notice. Lieutenant General John DeWitt, head of the Western Armed Forces, was also in full support and saw the need for search and seizure operations against Japanese Americans. He is known for publicly stating, "A Jap is a Jap." Many legislative orders ensued, but there are a few I'd like to highlight. February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing U.S. military commanders to designate military zones at their discretion and forming exclusion zones against those they saw fit to exclude, basically those of enemy ancestry, which primarily affected the Japanese American community. In March 1942, DeWitt issued Public Proclamation No. 1, which informed all those who had an ounce of Japanese ancestry that they would be subject to exclusion orders from Military Area No. 1, which comprised of the entire West Coast. Other orders followed, which included curfew laws and location registration. Shortly after, DeWitt issued Civilian Exclusion Order No. 346, ordering all citizens and non-citizens of Japanese ancestry to report to 16 assembly centers. Later, they would be moved to one of the more permanent relocation centers. All Japanese Americans were ordered to report for registration and further instruction for relocation. They suffered humiliation of being imprisoned as suspected traitors in their own country, their loyalty in question. A common Japanese phrase during this time was "shikita ga nai," or "it cannot be helped." As mentioned earlier, some key values in Japanese American culture are obedience, respect, and loyalty. Even though they lost their freedom and constitutional rights, They believed that cooperating with the government would prove their loyalty and help their country. By fall of 1942, they were interned in one of 10 relocation camps, where only 4 camps supported families with children. In early 1943, a loyalty questionnaire was given to each adult internee. There were 2 questions of importance. Number 27 asked if they were willing to serve in the U.S. military, and number 28, which asked them to swear allegiance to the U.S. and give up loyalty to Japan, a loyalty they never felt. From this, Roosevelt announced his decision to accept Japanese American volunteers into the U.S. military, thus forming the 100th Infantry Battalion and the famous 442nd Regiment Combat Team. This combat team was the most highly decorated combat team in American military history, who to their credit deserved their own presentation. Life in the camp was rough. Head counts took place twice a day. Living conditions were substandard. You could often find as many as 18 people living in a 15 by 20 room with no local lavatory nearby. Healthcare was poor and sickness was very common. The government encouraged the internees to establish communities within the camp and establish schools and churches to help them cope. Ironically, the U.S. government tried to spin the internment as providing protection for the Japanese Americans against racial extremists. The internees were confused, though, since the guns were always faced at them instead of away from them. This way of life would continue for the duration of the war until the full closure of camps in 1945. The Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL, was founded in 1929. It is the oldest and largest Asian civil rights organization. They strive to promote a world that honors diversity by respecting values of fairness, equality, and social justice. Their mission is to secure and maintain the civil rights of Japanese Americans and all others who are victimized by the injustice and bigotry. They work to promote cultural, educational, and social values and preserve the heritage and legacy of Japanese American communities. After the internment, the JACL assisted in the Japanese American resettlement across America. During the 1980s, they were the driving force behind the campaign for redress, which led Congress to pass the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 involved Congress recognizing that a grave injustice was done to both citizens and permanent residents of Japanese ancestry by the evacuation, relocation, and internment of civilians during World War II. As part of the redress, Congress submitted a formal apology to Japanese Americans. As a symbol of apology, the government awarded individual redress payments to survivors of internment. To many Japanese Americans, they saw this as a symbol of justice. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is a dark spot on American history and civil rights. The JACL's efforts work to educate and inform people about these events by funding educational workshops, museum exhibits, and cultural conventions. It is the hope that through education and understanding, we can remain vigilant so that this sort of tragedy doesn't happen again to any group of people in America. This concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.